Hello, my name is Trey and welcome to Telos Bound. Today I would like to talk about the essay Time and History by Giorgio Agamben from his book Infancy in History, particularly what he writes on the geometry of time consciousness. This will be the first part of a two-part series. I should note right away that he never actually uses the terms geometry or time consciousness. These are terms I decided to start using to refer to the subject matter that Agamben touches on in this essay. The subject matter in question is essentially the phenomenological experience of time and how it changes from one culture to the next, and how these changes in shape can be conceptualized geometrically, precisely because they are shapes. The three cultures Agamben focuses on are Antiquity, Christendom, and Modernity. This video will be a discussion on what he has to say on the matter, while also referencing some stuff outside of it. Agamben begins his essay by stating that, quote, "Every conception of history is invariably accompanied by a certain experience of time which is implicit in it, conditions it, and thereby has to be elucidated. Similarly, every culture is first and foremost a particular experience of time, and no new culture is possible without an alteration in this experience. The original task of a genuine revolution, therefore, is never merely to change the world, but also, and above all, to change time." Unquote. For Agamben, every culture contains its own particular experience of time, and this experience may be understood as that which structures the experience of the life world at large. Time is essentially the boundaries of any given worldview. It provides the horizon of possibility, as anything which can occur can only occur in time. Agamben will go on to critique the modern emphasis on history and its neglect of time, resulting in what he calls the, quote, "vulgar representation of time as a precise and homogeneous continuum, which, according to him, has plagued previous conceptions of historical materialism." He will then go on to discuss the ancient Greek experience of time. Since the human mind cannot grasp time in representation, but only experience it, it is necessarily represented by geometrical images. The shape which corresponds to the experience of time in antiquity is the circle. The Greeks experienced time as an eternally recurring cycle, with no absolute beginning, middle, and end. Plato, for example, measured time by the circular orbits of the heavenly bodies. To quote him, quote, "The creator of the world constructed a moving image of eternity, and in ordering the heavens from eternity one and unshifting, he made this image, which ever moves according to the laws of number, and which we call time." Unquote. Agamben doesn't mention this, but it should be noted that there are few treatments of the nature of time in the Platonic corpus. Modern scholarly research hasn't seemed to have reached a consensus on Plato's understanding of time, with some people interpreting his writings as not only saying that time is measured by the orbits of the celestial bodies, but that time literally is this movement. As R.E. Cushman puts it, quote, "Plato's treatment of time in the Timaeus left the impression that time had little or no existence apart from orderly movement, preeminently the orderly movement of the outermost heaven." Unquote. If Plato considered time to be identical with the movement of the celestial bodies, Aristotle categorically rejects this. Nonetheless, they both consider the shape of time to be that of a circle. To quote Aristotle, quote, "Time is thought to be the movement of the sphere because the other movements are measured by this, and time by this movement. This also explains the common saying that human affairs form a circle, and that there is a circle in all other things that have a natural movement and coming into being and passing away. This is because all other things are discriminated by time, and end and begin as though conforming to a cycle, for even time itself is thought to be a circle. And this opinion again is held because time is a measure of this kind of locomotion, and is itself measured by such. So that to say that the things that come into being form a circle is to say that there is a circle of time, and this is to say that it is measured by the circular movement, for apart from the measure nothing else is observed in what is measured. The whole is just a plurality of measures." Unquote. Thus, we've now established that the ancient Greeks considered time to be cyclical and eternal. The consequence of this experience is the lack of historical consciousness. While we won't bother quoting him here, Agamben demonstrates this fact by quoting a passage from Aristotle where he claims that there is no way to know whether we are before or after the Trojan War. For him, time was unceasingly returning back on itself, making any concrete notions of before and after essentially meaningless. Agamben will mention Herodotus's histories as an example as an attempt to ground history against the, quote, destructive character of time, unquote. The irony that Agamben seems to be unaware of is that the histories is actually a mistranslation. A more faithful translation would be the inquiries. This just goes to show the lack of historical consciousness in antiquity. Agamben then goes on to say that in Aristotle, we get the most clear representation of time as a precise, infinite, quantified continuum. It is this experience that, according to Agamben, has defined the history of the Western experience of time for 2 millennia. The quantified continuum of time consists of fleeting individual moments or instants. These, he says, are essentially geometrical points. An instant is a pure limit which both joins and divides the past and future. This point can be divided infinitely, and in this sense, the now is always other, as Aristotle puts it, quote, and besides, since the now is the end and the beginning of time, but not of the same time, but the end of time past and the beginning of time to come, it must present a relation analogous to the kind of identity between the convexity and the concavity of the same circumference, which necessitates a difference between that with respect to which it bears the other, unquote. The elusiveness or otherness of the now is, according to Agamben, the basis of Western man's inability to master time. Now let's talk about Christian time, which Agamben considers to be the antithesis of ancient Greek time. If the experience of time in antiquity can be represented by the circle, the Christian one can be represented by the ascending line. Nothing repeats itself. Every event only happens once. This revolutionary conception of time creates the space for true historicity. To quote Agamben, quote, in contrast with the directionless time of the classical world, this time has a direction and a purpose. It develops irreversibly from the creation to the end and has a central point of reference in the incarnation of Christ, which shapes its development as a progression from the initial fall to the final redemption. Thus, St. Augustine can oppose the falsi circuli of the Greek philosophers with the via recta of Christ, and the eternal repetition of paganism, where nothing is new, with Christian novitas, in which everything always occurs only once, unquote. This is pretty straightforward. However, I do think it's a little more complicated than how Agamben presents it. While it is true that history is linear in the Christian world, this does not mean that the notion of repetition is lost, as we briefly discussed in the previous video on Hans' Scent of Time. In his magnum opus From Dawn to Decadence, Jacques Barzun says the following concerning medieval Christians. Quote, they merged time and space indiscriminately. They mingled fact and legend and miracle, and being preoccupied with eternity, they took sameness and continuity as more real than development and change. Hence, no history in the modern sense, unquote. Nonetheless, I believe Agamben is essentially correct here. Christianity does introduce linearity, and hence the possibility of historical consciousness. After establishing that Christian time is one of linearity, he will reference St. Augustine, who interiorized time and explicitly rejected any association between time and the movement of bodies. Unfortunately, it seems as if he never found the answer to the question, what is time? A question which tormented him in his Confessions. However, Agamben interprets him to essentially say that time exists within the human mind. And this is the big difference between St. Augustine and the Hellenistic philosophers. However, Augustine does remain within the Aristotelian framework of considering time to be the continuum of fleeting points or instances. He explicitly says that the present has no length. Agamben claims that Augustine is essentially Hellenizing the Christian experience of time, asserting that prior to him, time was experienced in a, quote, fuller, more original, and tangible way. In any case, the point is that in Christianity, time shifts from an eternal cycle to a single linear narrative, and it maintains the same Aristotelian premise of time being constituted by the succession of nows. Now let us move on to discuss time in modernity. According to Agamben, modern time is a secularization of Christian linear time. What is lost in modernity, however, is the concept of end. An open-ended future is posited, in contrast to the eschatological time of Christianity. As we discussed in the previous video on this channel, endings are crucial to any experience of completion, narrative, or meaningful time. Because of this, I think Agamben underemphasizes the shift in time consciousness that occurs in the death of God. However, it is a relatively short essay, so he just doesn't write enough for us to make any absolute claims concerning his position on the matter. In any case, the point is that in modernity, we lose any notion of completion, and the world becomes an endless process. It is this notion of process that ultimately evolves into the notion of progress, which will confer some semblance of meaning and teleology to the succession of nows which constitutes denarrativized process time. To quote Agamben, quote, "As Nietzsche had already grasped, with Hartmann's process of the world, the idea governing the 19th century concept of history is that of process. Only process as a whole has meaning, never the precise fleeting now. But since this process is really no more than a simple succession of now in terms of before and after, and the history of salvation has meanwhile become pure chronology, a semblance of meaning can be saved only by introducing the idea, albeit one lacking any rational foundation, of a continuous infinite progress. Under the influence of the natural sciences, development and progress, which merely translate the idea of a chronologically orientated process, become the guiding categories of historical knowledge." Unquote. This, according to Agamben, creates a deeply inauthentic experience of time in modernity. I must admit that I'm not sure if I fully understand him here, but I'll give my best attempt to explain what he says concerning this inauthenticity. Essentially, the notions of development and progress act as reified, almost Platonic ideas which are imposed upon history. These two notions, which are essentially technological in nature, act as transcendental structures of interpreting history, and this impedes authentic historicity. It is, to quote Agamben, the, quote, "radical negation of history in the name of an ideal of knowledge modeled on the natural sciences." Unquote. It attempts to artificially impose an objective historical continuity, one which does not truly account for humanity in its experience of the world. Thus, he will say that the goal of his critique is not to abandon history, but to achieve a more authentic concept of historicity. This will be discussed in the following video. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video and got some value from it. If you did, I would appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel. It would really mean a lot. I also have some links in the description you may be interested to check out, plus the sources which I referenced in this video. That's all I have for today. Thanks again for watching, and may God bless you all.